Welcome. I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, In the Beginning, the Book of Genesis. Today we'll be talking about Lesson 8 of our study, which covers the book of Genesis, chapter 12, verse 1 through chapter 14, verse 24. Here, we get into, as we've been building toward this shift, we get into kind of the second section of the book of Genesis, which will be the rest of it, which is Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And we follow the stories of these few particular related guys. This part is a lot more like something that's historical and a lot less like something that's mythological. We saw some of that transition point already. We already talked about that, but this marks kind of a new character of literature in the book and storytelling. So here is our transition point. It picks up with Abram and his journey. And it's also very important that this is categorized as a journey. For quite some time, these people are going to be traveling people. And with the beginning of Abram's journey is also a promise that at some point the people will settle in the land he's only going to be a traveler in. And much of the next phase of the history of these people is going to be journeying that begins with Abram and extends for, you can read ahead to find out how long. It's not a short journey. This is interesting to see as God is founding his people that they're traveling people because it has implications for us. The place that we currently inhabit as Christians is one that we're not meant to get too comfortable in or to consider as our ultimate home. Our spiritual lives, like that of the patriarchs, are meant to be journeying in a land that is not ours and moving toward a final destination. So in that regard, there are interesting parallels that we can and will talk about and develop here between how they're beginning their relationship with God as a people and how we go about doing that as well. So the kind of the arc of Abram we're getting into then is one of traveling, and it's one of his relationship with God developing, right? We jump into Abram's story at the time that he begins his relationship with God, and we travel along that journey. And the two are co-equally important, right? Abram without God, not important. God without Abram doesn't have people to act through in the world. The relationship between God and Abram creates this thing that is worth interacting with and us following along. Not unlike ultimately happens in a much fuller way in the form of Jesus Christ. And with that, Abram brings God's promises into play in the world as well, right? God promises to bless Abram and to bless the world through Abram, and brings other things to fruition as well that we'll see. So ultimately, this relationship God has with Abram becomes a means through which blessing comes to the world. And it's because of Abram listening to, obeying God, right? Much is made ultimately of Abram's faith, and we'll talk about that some as well. But this becomes like the model for a relationship with God and how that can affect all of the world, right? Until Jesus, this is like the model of how an individual personal relationship between one person and God can affect and alter the face of the whole world. So it's really interesting to see how this develops and what comes of it, and to see that everywhere Abram goes and everything he does, God is blessing. Even in areas where you'd think intuitively, oh, this is going to go badly, or, oh, Abram's getting the worst end of this deal. And always, with God on his side, things turn out for the good for Abram in everything he does. And that blessing by God of Abram and the things that he does becomes a very significant point for all of these people as well, and for his descendants. So we get to see a lot of things begin to develop here as Abram forms a relationship with God and begins that journey. It is unclear here, fascinatingly unclear, if Abram had any pre-existing relationship with God. We're jumping into the middle of Abram's story. He's already, as we'll learn, not young. So like the later middle, maybe even, you would say. He's been established. He's had, he was pretty sure he knew what his life was going to be, right? And had been, and was settled. He was married. He lived with his family. He was comfortable. And then he has this conversation with God. He knows enough to know that it's God speaking to him. So the idea of God was at least familiar with him. We don't know if he had a pre-existing relationship with God or if this is the first time God ever spoke to him. And we don't know, it's words, right? We don't know the means by which God communicated, but we know, God speaks to Abram in a way that, we put words to in the text, right? We can quote it. It's words. It's not just some vague feeling or, bird sign or something, right? It's, very clear instructions. And what does God say to Abram? Does he say, hey, pal, you're doing great. Keep it up. You're comfortable, right? Good. You're doing right what we want, right? When God speaks to us, it's never to maintain the status quo. I think ever. Or there's no need for that communication, right? So if you are discussing really trying to talk to God, perhaps be prepared for that to require change on your part. That seems to be one of the characteristics of God doesn't talk to you about the weather, right? Except, I guess, unless you're Noah. But in general, God does not engage in idle conversation, right? If he's talking to you, it is impactful, and it's because something needs to be not the way that it is. And you have a choice to make in that regard. So what does God present here to this later middle-aged guy, Abram? Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. So this is what I want you to do, and this is vaguely what's going to come out of it, which is mostly for after you. You do this, and then later, your name will be great nation, blessing to everybody, but that's a lot more for the future and a lot less for you, Abram. There's not really, sometimes it's really easy in our conversations with God also to go for the what's in it for me angle, right? This is a lot of God explaining what's going to happen, and none of that is what's in it for Abram. It's all God's plan. And I think that is a useful thing also for us to get in mind is you don't serve God for what's in it for you. You serve God because you love God and you want to serve God. And you want to see God's plan and God's will come to fruition, and not for what's in it for you. But I think that can be a challenging mindset to get used to, right? This is why Abram is and becomes our father of the faith, right? An example of, and again, we've talked about it on a lot of these videos, but in case you've missed it before, faith doesn't mean belief, it means trust, right? God says to Abram, go, and all this stuff's going to happen. And Abram says, sign me up, with nothing in it for him, and goes because he wants to fulfill God's vision. And he trusts that he'll be taken care of along the way. That is our lesson here, right? When we talk to God, and we legitimately hear from God and aren't deluding ourselves or, varying forms of telling ourselves things we want to hear that we pass off as prayer, which, to be honest, is easy enough to do sometimes. God, if you want me to keep going the way I am, give me absolutely no sign. That must mean you're okay, right? Like, it's so easy to settle into it. No criticism. It's hard to know sometimes and to discern when God is talking to us and when he's not. And it is, if we're not careful, easy to mix up the two. One way to tell is not an infallible one. You need other discernment. But if it's a suggestion to go do something that makes you somewhat uncomfortable outside of your comfort zone towards something that has no immediate in it for you thing, that sounds an awfully lot like it could be God. And if it's instead an indication that you should do something you really want to do anyway, that's pretty self-serving, maybe that's not God. It could be, but again, discernment matters. But if you're looking for a general guideline, that isn't a bad way to think about it. So God tells Abram, go, leave everything you're familiar with behind, and I, God, am going to benefit from that. And Abram, we will see how he responds, but he's the guy that God feels comfortable showing up and asking that of, which already tells you something about who he is. And that sets us on the beginning of a wonderful journey. And from this journey that we're starting here with one guy, again, worth keeping in mind, the broader perspective is what God wants to bring about is ultimately blessing for everyone on earth. Starting with one guy listening to something uncomfortable that God tells them, ultimately, and we see this is like, there's a way to argue, and one of the Gospels does, that this is the beginning of our journey of salvation history, right? And that this one guy going when he's asked to sets in motion things that lead to the salvation of all of humanity through first this guy and his kin, and then broader and broader and broader. But if you trace that series of dominoes back, there's a version of looking at that starts with God shows up to Abram and says, go. And then all of humanity is redeemed from their sins because one guy says, sure. Also interesting, and I think relevant and useful for us, we don't see what Abram says back to God. God speaks to Abram and says, go. So Abram went. Not so Abram starts to haggle about logistics with God. It's just God says go. Abram's response isn't a verbal response, it's an active response. This again is an excellent model for us for prayer, right? Like, the objective of attempting to talk to God in prayer, there are a number of lots of kinds of prayer, right? But ultimately, if you're trying to form a relationship with God, that, because of, how all of that works, it's not about a lot of deep conversation all the time, right? It really is call and response, right? Like, if you feel like God is telling you to do something, our invitation isn't really to discuss that. You can, and you can ask for clarification, and God might oblige you in all of that, and you can talk to other people about what you think God is telling you to do. And I'm not saying there's not a role for talking and communication and conversation, but the model, and I think a lot of the saints have demonstrated this as well, is if you feel like you're sure that God is asking you to do something, you're past the point where the talking part is the part of what is helpful, right? Like, then you're to the doing part. And the neat thing about Abram is he just, like, his enthusiasm is such a great model, right? Like, he just does it. He just goes. God says, leave everything in your life behind. And he says, yeah, sure, go. And that is where this becomes such a good model. And interestingly, he doesn't go alone. I think it was probably kind of a given at that time that his wife would go with him. But Lot also, his brother's son Lot, also goes with him. And some hangers on. He's not going alone. He's deciding the fate of several other people as well, as he goes. But the one God asked to go is Abram, right? And that's where the story centers around. So they go. As they go, he gets to the land that he's meant to go to, and God says, this, I'm going to give it to your descendants, not to you, to your descendants. Look all around, all of this, your descendants get to have it. Isn't that great news, Abram, that you're here and you've traveled here for me, and look at what not you is going to get. Isn't that a great consolation for you? We'll get to how that is later in Abram's story, because that does seem to address his core problem as well and what's in it for him. But for now, like, that's maybe not what you want to hear again when God says, hey, disrupt everything, and then you do it, and it's yeah, thanks, that's going to work out well for not you. And that's, again, like, Abram is enthusiastic about this. Would I be? It shows us much about the attitude. Like, he's thrilled to see that, right? He builds an altar. Yeah, great. That'll happen, God. Good. And he celebrates it. And then we see another interesting thing. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. What is that? We don't know yet. He does. That just eventually God reveals his name to Moses, and it's passed on in a way that we all learn. Before that, he is the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And they know, and we don't. Unless it's the Lord. But it seems like the implication is that there is a personal connection and relationship here that Abram has that he can do that isn't passed on outside of Abram. So he can call on the name of the Lord, and we're stuck thinking, what's that? Because it's just between those guys now. It's the God of Abraham, now Abram. And it time has to pass and things have to develop before God reveals his name to his people in a way that they can call on him. But Abram has that right now. And that is an interesting thing to think about as we look at how this relationship between God and humanity grows and develops. So Abram is now traveling. We're going to see a few things in Abram's adventures that are maybe a little jarring, and this is one of them. It also foreshadows some important ideas. Namely, if there's famine, you can go to Egypt and there might be food. As it turns out, is an important thing to remember later, and we'll come back to that in the book of Genesis. Beyond that, there is this deception. We definitely, modern morality and all of that, don't, lying is bad, right? We are now in a place where, like, as Christians, it's just lying is bad, right? And generally don't do that. And this kind of thing is not amazing. But back then, different situation, and, you know, they were desperate with the famine, and this is not stupid either, right? Like, think about the situation, right? If we accept the premise that Sarai, at her age, when Abram is 76, is just incredibly attractive, then that poses a problem. He knows he's going to a foreign place and that her beauty puts him in danger, right? The idea is she's a woman, she's essentially property. It would be easy to overpower, to kill Abram and take his property, which is his wife. And he seems to believe that that is the thing that would be desirable to do by Pharaoh, and Pharaoh's response when he gets there kind of justifies that, yes, that could have been a thing that might have happened. So Abram is not wrong about his assumptions either, right? And his plan of action is also effective. So lying aside, because these days that would be frowned upon, this is clever, and it shows us how Abram deals with problems, and that he is able to anticipate a potential problem and come up with a solution. The solution is, if he doesn't own her as a wife, but owns her as family, then she is up for grabs, right? So then, instead of removing him and cleaning her, the idea is to try to woo him into giving her away. And so Abram is welcomed rather than being killed because of presenting the relationship incorrectly or mischaracterizing the core part of how that relationship works. And so Abram is, as her brother, is very well received and is given stuff with the hope that he might be talked into giving away his sister, who is his wife. So that's what's going on. That is the plan that he's put in place, and the reason is he fears for his life if he doesn't. So Pharaoh has, while they're staying in Egypt, taken Sarai into his house. With, of course, the implication of all of the things that go along with that. Again, different time, different situation. Abram's plan seems to have been reflective of, or understanding seems to be reflective of, the situation as it was. And the plan worked according to what the suggestion was. Weird situation, right? This is not a thing we'd be okay with now. Reiterating, the way we view things from a Christian point of view, this is not okay. But that was not this. So glossing over some of that. Pharaoh finds that when he has taken the wife of somebody on good terms with God as his wife, that is not pleasing to God. And in more foreshadowing, that violation by Pharaoh causes great plagues to come upon Pharaoh's house and Egypt, because Pharaoh is standing in opposition to God. And Pharaoh says, "Why did you deceive me that way? I totally wouldn't have done this way, and everything would have been fine if you had just said that she's your wife." Which, again, now we're taking the word of Pharaoh against that of Abram. I'm inclined to think Abram was probably right? He predicted how everything was going to play out. He probably had a point, right? We don't know. Maybe Pharaoh's being totally straightforward and he would have not interfered at all. Who knows? But in that case, we don't know, right? What we know is God is displeased with what Pharaoh does, and the fact that he was deceived doesn't matter. What matters is what he does, not what he meant to do. And plagues come about, and at that point, Pharaoh says, "Well, this is too big for me, right? Like this is not what I meant to do for sure. Is to anger God. So get away from me. Get out. Take your stuff. Take your wife. Get out. I don't want any part of this. Just leave." Which works very well for Abram because of all the aforementioned stuff that Pharaoh gave him. Like this, he leaves Egypt in much better shape than he entered Egypt. And still alive, importantly, which was a concern that he had. So they get through the famine. They leave better off than they arrived. Sarah probably doesn't have a particularly enjoyable time in Egypt. Again, just a thing that is here in the Bible, and an unfortunate thing at that. But there it is. It's there. It's what we say happened. In Abram's story, he's been journeying, and he's now leaving Egypt, quite a bit richer than he arrived. So they leave Egypt and return to Canaan. Still not theirs, but that doesn't seem like a major concern. And they go back to where Abram had previously built an altar, and it looks like their intention is to stay around there for a while. But, they have such a common problem. They're just so rich now that they have all of this stuff and all of these people supporting all of these flocks and all of this stuff, Abram and Lot both, and it's just they're so crowded into this space with all of their wealth that it's creating strife among all of their servants. Very relatable problem, for sure, that I know we've all experienced. But what this starts to show us is the effect of God's favor and blessing, right? Like, blessings are so common now in our practice of our faith that we, I think, downplay or don't fully appreciate the significance of Abram being blessed by God and what that means, right? Like, everything he does, he's practically King Midas, right? Except instead of things turning to gold, they turn to like flocks of livestock, which are basically gold also. And he just manages in everything that he does to become increasingly wealthy. That is a thing that continues to matter, that God's favor manifests and looks that way. it'll be a key point for all of the rest of the book of Genesis. So important to track from the beginning that God's favor and God's blessing is a big deal. But for now, it's a big deal that's causing a problem between Lot and Abram because they just have so much stuff. Here we also see more of how Abram makes decisions. So, and how that works out for him, right? So he says to Lot, yep, we can't both fit. You go wherever you want, and I'll go somewhere else. He gives first choice and preference to Lot and is willing to make it work on his own with whatever is left over. Lot not saying, oh, Abram, it's because of you that I'm so wealthy. Why don't you take the good area and I'll tag along nearby. Instead says, that looks like the best spot. I'm going there. This tells us a lot about who Lot is and a lot about who Abram is, right? Abram's someone who doesn't care and we'll see is just fine for that. And Lot's selfishness in that kind of sets the stage for what happens. It also, Lot goes in an area by where there are settlements and cities, and Abram stays on the move. God has already told Abram, he's never going to come into possession of the land, which implies his whole life is going to be a journey. He's fine with that and continues on that view of things. Lot moves more toward settling down. Through much of the Old Testament and for a long time to come from here, the idea of people settling and grouping and cities in general are bad. I think we've talked about it some here, and we'll talk about it more if you journey with us into Exodus as well. It continues to be a theme, right? When you get people who get too close together, who settle into and form a city, in the Bible, often that means bad and corrupt things are going to happen. In this particular case, some of those cities are Sodom and Gomorrah, which we'll certainly come back to. But Lot chooses that. That's where his head's at on all of this. And Abram is very content to not join city dwelling and to continue with his herds and to stay on the move and to live in a tent and all of that, while Lot gets comfortable with the idea of settling. After Abram has given choice of where to live to Lot, and Lot is gone, then God shows up and says, yeah, that choice, totally irrelevant. I don't care about Lot. Look around. Everything you can see, that's yours, except not yours, your descendants. And boy, howdy, are there going to be a lot of them. They're going to need all of this land. There are going to be so many descendants that you're going to have. And this land right here, like even the part that Lot went into, that's yours. And not his, but yours, Abram. So we are building on what God is promising to Abram, right? Land, look around, all of that. Descendants, you're going to be blessed and you will be a blessing to all of the nations. God is loading this guy up with promises, right? And all future-looking promises. That sets so much of the stage for the history of these people, are these promises that inherently can't and won't be fulfilled in Abram's lifetime, so that you have generations after, extending even into today, trying to claim the promises that God made to Abram. It's a big deal. This foundation that is being laid and these promises that are being made. And we will, beyond even the book of Genesis, it's important to track these promises and how they're developing as you read all of the Bible, but especially the Old Testament. These matter through all of your reading and study of Scripture. So again, what are they? Here, this land, it's going to be yours. It's going to be full of your descendants, too many to count. And you will be blessed, and you will be a blessing to all the peoples of the earth. And here again, after God has made that promise, Abram settles and he builds an altar to the Lord. Not the first time and not the last time. Kind of gloss over mentioning it a few of the times, but it's worth noting when Abram has an encounter with God that he thinks is significant, or when he's staying somewhere for a long period of time, or it seems like it's a day that ends in Y, whatever, he builds altars, right? That is the thing that he does. And we've seen him offer some kind of sacrifice, and that's kind of the implication, that he's using them to offer sacrifice to God, but that hasn't yet been ritualized in a way where we have a priesthood that does that, and we know kind of the rules behind all of that. There seems to be some, and spoiler, but I don't think anybody probably is going to be spoiled by this. It is an important part of Abram's story that some amount of offering sacrifice to God is the thing that was already happening, and that sacrifice is bloody. That becomes kind of key with his son Isaac, as you probably all know. But if you don't worry about it yet. We'll get there. But that is a thing that is a part of his practice, but it's not inherently the same thing that it becomes when you start to have a priesthood that is about the offering of sacrifice. So we'll see in a bit here in this lesson yet some interesting things with the priesthood, and I'll talk a little bit more about it as well. But for now, know that there is some kind of religious practice around the use of these altars and sacrifice, and that it's likely not at all the same thing that it eventually becomes when it's more ritualized and formalized with the priests later. Here we get into local politics. This seems like a lot of kings if you're familiar with the later parts of the Bible. This is how a lot of this developed in the ancient world, right? You start with you didn't have a lot of infrastructure that allowed for large scale management of lots of people, right? So you ended up with very small regional groups of somebody in power. And you didn't really very easily have the ability to extend that and manage a whole lot. So you had lots of small areas, and they had kings. As technology develops, as infrastructure develops, as militaries and transportation and supplies and all of that develops, you can start to have larger and larger kingdoms and fewer kings. And eventually we get greatly consolidated. And a lot of the story of the ancient world is one of how those things develop and how kingdoms form out of smaller units, which is way beyond the scope here. But that's all to say, it's not at all surprising or unreasonable that there were a lot of kings around, right? And they existed in groupings and alliances that governed the dynamics of power in a region. What we learn here is Abram has largely stayed out of meddling in local politics, right? All of this is going on and he's not involved. He's not trying to exert political power or authority. He's just trying to exist. It's not his land. He's not claiming to be a king. He's not claiming ownership. He's just there as a rich guy who's probably paying dues to keep everybody happy and friendly and is otherwise attempting to stay out of it. What you've got is one group of kings who is tired of being kind of subject to another king and people who are still following him who decide to rebel. And they fail and are put down in that rebellion. And a thing that occurs while that's all happening is collateral damage. The king putting down the rebellion captures Lot as a part of what is happening. I'm not trying to name them because there are tons of kings and tons of names and they don't matter past this. The important part is Lot gets caught up in the crossfire here of this quashed rebellion and is taken captive. The key thing we learn here is how Abram has managed to stay out of any kind of conflict and rich at the same time in this land, which is he has a standing army that's his, that he, again, like now, we don't think anything of that, but at the time when resources are relatively scarce, the cost of feeding 300 people who could be just trained soldiers and primarily focus on that, that is expensive, right? Like, again, he's really rich that he's doing that, and he's wise in that he has taken those steps which have allowed him to stay free from conflict, right? All of this conflict is going on and nobody involves him, right? He's sitting on the sidelines and everybody's more than happy as long as he's not interfering. Everybody's more than happy to leave it that way. He's taken the steps he needs to take to stay out of conflict. But Lot has not and has gotten involved. So now Abram has to go see to Lot. He feels the call of kin there and feels like he needs to go intervene. So he takes his troops, he goes and intervenes. All these rebelling kings lost, and Abram by himself is able to win a victory here, which also tells us something of significance about God's blessing and how it works. It's not just material prosperity. It is also comes with success in war, which also is a theme that continues for these people for a long time. So Abram wins and is able to bring back Lot and all of the captured goods. This is also, after this, Abram is generally able to go back to being uninvolved in local politics and war, so we don't really see him dabble much in conflict after this either. He kind of made his point, and I think everybody leaves him alone, and it's only later that these people get involved again in conflict. But Abram wins, brings Lot back. So victorious Abram goes out to meet defeated kings who were waiting around and brings them back the stuff that he took from the previously victorious kings who are now the defeated ones, thanks to Abram. And he brings them all of their stuff back. And he has a conversation with two of them. The king of Sodom, who that conversation centers around, here's your stuff. Really, you want some of it? No, I don't want any of your stuff because we can't have it said that you made me rich. God is the one who made me rich. And that's the exchange there. And he passes over the stuff. And that part is kind of normal. The other king who's here, who is not listed in the role of rebelling kings, but who is now here in Abram's return, is the king of Salem, Melchizedek, who is described as priest of God Most High, interesting role that this guy has. The fascinating thing here, Abram is far away from home. He has met a foreign king in this place far away from home, and that king is a priest of the God that Abram serves. There aren't other priests that we know of where Abram came from of God. This is the only one we've seen. We don't know where he came from. We don't know what happens after. He's also a king, and he offers a different kind of sacrifice to God. His priesthood, it's not, Abram's been going around offering sacrifices and will continue to. This isn't that. He brings out bread and wine and offers it. His sacrifice or his offering is not violent and it's not bloody. And it doesn't involve killing. And he wasn't listed as being involved in the war. And Salem means peace. This is the King of Peace. Such a random guy, right? And we don't hear from him again either. In the letter to the Hebrews, the author makes a very big deal of this guy. He is a priest not of the type or of the order of Aaron, right? All of that, Aaron isn't yet, right? Like all of the priesthood that comes to be, how it functions, what it does, that it's hereditary, everything about the eventual priesthood of these people leads back up to and stops at the point of Aaron. And that is one model for the priesthood. Melchizedek comes up also briefly in a psalm, which the letter to the Hebrews also mentions, but there is this vague idea based on this one passage, and a reference to it in a psalm, and a discussion of all of that in the letter to the Hebrews, that there is another order of priesthood, the order of Melchizedek, that one of its main characteristics is, the Aaronic priesthood is hereditary, right? You're a guy, you're a priest as long as you're a guy, and then you die, and the priesthood continues through your descendants, and it's very transitory in that regard. The only Old Testament priest in the order of Melchizedek is Melchizedek. It's weird that he would be a priest of God where he is and who he is. He has no clear beginning, and we don't know what comes of his story after. He has no clear end. To himself, his line, his priesthood, and that gives rise to the idea of you are a priest forever after the order, or according to the order of Melchizedek. The eternal nature of this priesthood, the non-transitory nature of it, becomes one of the defining characteristics of what this is. And then the fact that the sacrifice that is offered is unbloody becomes an interesting contrast with the Aaronic priesthood as well. It doesn't exist to atone for sin the way the Aaronic priesthood does, right? That whole thing is about people you have gone astray from God and need to be brought back in line. These are the mechanisms by which that will happen. And this priesthood, right? The priests are Levites, and ultimately priests are appointed after the people go astray and because of an act of bloodshed and violence. And that becomes a characteristic of that. But this king of Salem wasn't involved in the military conflict. Salem means peace. He doesn't kill an animal to sacrifice it. None of those things associated with the other main priesthood are associated with this guy. Death doesn't touch this guy, right? Or his sacrifice. He doesn't kill. And we don't see him die. And he's just a random entity that exists that's worth talking a lot more about in the letter to the Hebrews. But here it is worth noting this is a thing that much is made of. And he is king and priest without, in the Bible, beginning or end. And his priesthood is characterized by life rather than death. And that becomes something that is associated with Jesus Christ. And also as his function, rather than atoning for sin, he offers blessing. He blesses Abram, and Abram gives him a tithe. This is their relationship. And Abram clearly greatly values him, right? We don't see Abram give a tithe to anybody else. As much as, he's kind of easygoing with Lot. You can't imagine that he grows as rich as he is by going around giving a lot of stuff away to people. But he shows his respect for this priest of God. This raises, and again, it becomes more relevant and interesting to talk about in light of Christ, but it raises a really fascinating core question about the priesthood in the Old Testament, right? Like, this is the one that exists proactively, and the priesthood of Aaron exists reactively as a solution to a problem. The Aaronic priesthood is, by and large, never successful in anything that it intends to do. Melchizedek seems quite successful. The contrast between the two is fruitful to reflect on. And ultimately, the priesthood that Jesus can claim as a priest of God is one that is attributable to his eternal nature and is in line with this priesthood much more than the priesthood of Aaron, though he does offer a sacrifice for the redemption of sins, and he does take up functions of the Aaronic priesthood as well. He has no by birth right to claim it, right? He's of the tribe of Judah. He's not a Levitical priest. He is, however, being God, eternal, and he has every right to claim the mantle of priest according to the order of Melchizedek. And so Jesus' priesthood, he claims this priesthood more than that one. Not explicitly so, but again, that's the letter to the Hebrews gets into that. It's worth reading and reflecting on. And we have videos on that and a study on that if you'd like to have some guidance through that journey as well. But for here, really interesting, important guy. It shows how, especially back in the book of Genesis and Exodus, a couple verses from something in the Bible that are never brought up again can be so foundational to where we go. And why it can be helpful to, especially if you're relatively new to studying the Bible, to work along with something like the Turning to God's Word Bible studies, so someone can call attention to the things that become important to you, at least to some of them, so that you don't miss stuff, because it's really easy to... This could just be another guy who's one of like 80 kings mentioned here in this chapter, and it would be very easy to read over. So anyway, plug for why guided Bible study can definitely be a helpful thing when you're getting into it as well. But to leave us with this lesson, Abram doing very well, rich, succeeding in local politics, making friends. He cares about Lot and is clearly willing to go to some effort to make sure that Lot is okay. He is very devoted to God, up to and including offering a tenth to the priest of God. He is blessed and prospering in everything he does. He can exert some military influence. He's been promised descendants, the land, and to be a blessing to all people. That is, and we know above all, he is obedient to God and is willing to go where God says. That is a lot of character development for one lesson. This Abram guy is off to a very strong start. He might just turn into somebody important. This has been an overview of Lesson 8 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study, In the Beginning, the Book of Genesis. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.